The automatic doors at Kellerton Regional's emergency bay blew open at 3:07 in the morning, and the man on the gurney was already the wrong color. Not the gray of unconsciousness, the bloodless white that crept in from the edges and worked inward, the kind Ivy Salas had learned to read the way her father had once taught her to read a dog's posture. By the time the gurney cleared the threshold, she could already name what she was looking at. He was compensating. Whatever was keeping him alive right now, it wasn't going to keep doing it indefinitely. She saw the blood second. A field dressing on his right upper chest, soaked through and badly positioned. Someone had packed it fast and in conditions that weren't a trauma bay. She was already moving toward him when she saw the third thing, and the third thing stopped her. The dog was a Belgian Malinois, low-slung and coiled, positioned across the man's legs with its head turned outward toward the room. Not leashed. No handler. Just the dog and the gurney and the two federal paramedics pushing it, who were leaning at a combined 20-degree angle away from the animal. Which told Ivy everything she needed to know about what had happened the last time someone tried to touch their patient. Dr. Anand reached the gurney first. He was 12 steps ahead of Ivy and moving fast, gloves already on, and the dog's posture shifted in a single fluid motion, weight forward, spine level, a sound low enough that Ivy felt it before she heard it. Anand stopped. "Get the handler," he said, voice flat. The paramedic on the left shook his head. Federal transport, no handler on scene, the dog was in the vehicle with him. Then get animal control. 25 minutes minimum. Behind her, Ivy heard someone say we have maybe 10. She didn't know if that was accurate, but the color of the man's skin made it feel accurate. She had stopped at the edge of the group. She was watching the dog, not the patient, which she knew was clinically backwards, and did it anyway. The animal was a retired working dog. She could tell from the tactical collar the specific way it had chosen its position. Not attacking, not even threatening, exactly. Guarding. There was a difference. And the difference was significant, and she found herself shifting 2 steps left without thinking about why. The dog's head turned. It looked at her. Ivy did not speak. She let her arms drop loose at her sides, kept her breathing even, and held the eye contact. In the silence that followed, 4, maybe 5 seconds, something shifted in the animal's expression. Some small readjustment around the eyes. It looked at her face, then down, at her right wrist. The bracelet. She'd worn it for 4 years. A single length of paracord, faded olive and brown, knotted at the clasp in the specific double-loop pattern her father had used for every harness he'd ever rigged at Fort Selby's K-9 training facility. She'd taken it from his workbench the morning after his funeral, cut a length free, and tied it herself. She hadn't told anyone at the hospital what it was. There was nothing to tell. The dog stepped back from the gurney. Not far, maybe 1.5 feet, but it stepped back, and its posture shifted from do not approach to something else, something Ivy recognized from years of watching her father work, a quality of watchful permission, like a gate unlatched but not yet opened. She moved toward the gurney before anyone spoke. She kept her hands visible, kept her pace deliberate. When she reached the gurney, she looked down at the patient for the first time. Male, mid-30s, the kind of physical build that came from sustained functional training. The field dressing had been done right in concept and wrong in position. Whoever packed it had done it under pressure and without good light. The wound was higher than it looked. She pressed 2 fingers to the hollow of his neck. "He's tachycardic," she said, heart rate around 115, dropping. "He's been bleeding inside that dressing longer than the packaging suggests." She looked up at Anand. "We need to move him now." The room exhaled, not loudly, the specific sound of multiple people releasing a held breath at the same moment. Then the team reformed around the gurney, and the dog repositioned with them, fluid and precise, and did not block anyone. If you've stayed with this story this far, don't leave. What happens in the next 6 hours changes everything, for Barnett, for the investigation, and for a woman who spent years being exactly what this situation needed without anyone knowing she was. Hit like and tell me what city you're reading from. I want to know how far this reaches. His name was Theo Barnett. That was what the single intake form said, tucked into a waterproof sleeve clipped to the gurney rail. No next of kin listed. A phone number for a federal extension that the night desk clerk had tried twice without reaching anyone. A blood type, a known allergy to sulfa drugs. That was all. The dog's collar tag read Echo, stamped in capital letters, worn at the edges in the way that meant years of use and not neglect. Echo positioned himself at the foot of the trauma bay bed and stayed there while the team worked. Not obstructing, not interacting, tracking the room with amber eyes that moved from face to face in a systematic pattern, the way a trained animal cataloged a space. He lay down once the monitors were attached. He did not look away from the door. Ivy stayed past the handoff. She told herself it was the documentation. She stayed because of Echo. She knew that was irrational. She stayed anyway, restocking the supply cart near the bay entrance while the OR team prepped Barnett for the procedure that was going to take the next 2 hours and either fix the problem or confirm how serious it was. She was there when the footsteps came from the main corridor. The wrong cadence, too deliberate, something with a slightly harder sole compound than standard hospital rubber. She turned before the person spoke. 2 of them. Dark civilian clothes, credentials already visible. The taller one, a woman with close-cropped natural hair and the kind of eye contact that had been professionally calibrated to land somewhere between approachable and immovable, spoke first. Ivy Salas. Yes. Special Agent Claudette Farkas, FBI. She held the badge just long enough to confirm it. The man you just stabilized works for us. We need a few minutes. The family consultation room off the main corridor, uncomfortable chairs, a box of tissues no one touched. Agent Farkas across from Ivy and her partner. Agent Spear, who had introduced himself on the walk over in a tone that suggested the introduction was procedural rather than personal, sitting to the side with a tablet he kept looking at rather than at Ivy. You were the first medical staff to make contact with the patient, Farkas said. Echo made that possible. Yes, about Echo. Farkas set her hands flat on the table. Barnett received Echo 18 months ago through the Federal Service Dog Transition Program. In that time, Echo has not permitted contact from an unfamiliar person without Barnett present and coherent. Not once until tonight. She paused. We need to understand why. Ivy looked at her wrist, the bracelet. She hadn't thought about it in months. The way you stopped thinking about things you wore every day. My father, she said, he spent 22 years as a military working dog handler at Fort Selby. I grew up going out to the kennels with him, training runs, exercises, conditioning sessions. I know what those dogs smell like. I know what the handlers smell like. She looked at the worn paracord. I know what this smells like to a dog that was trained in that environment. Farkas was quiet for a moment. Fort Selby is where Echo was trained. I know. Your father died 4 years ago. Heart attack 3 months after he retired. She said it without performance. The bracelet is from his workbench. Spear made a note. He hadn't looked up. Farkas studied her with the expression of someone recalibrating what they'd expected to find. I want to be honest with you, Miss Salas. The fact that you were able to make contact with Echo tonight is not a coincidence we can set aside. Barnett was brought here because this was the nearest trauma-capable facility. We didn't choose this hospital, but someone knew he was coming here within 90 minutes of the transport call going out. The room was quiet. That's a short window, Ivy said. It is. Barnett came out of surgery at 6:40 in the morning. The wound had been more complicated than the initial assessment suggested. The bullet had traveled at an unusual angle, clipping the upper lobe of the right lung before stopping against the posterior rib. 2 hours of repair work. He was moved to recovery on the 3rd floor, under a name in the system that was not Theo Barnett, with a room assignment that only 5 people in the hospital had access to. Echo went with him. Nobody argued about it. Ivy went home, fed her cat, lay down. She was back at the hospital by noon. She told herself it was the follow-up documentation. That was partially true. What was fully true was that she'd been running the numbers on the transport window since Farkas's words in the consultation room, and the number she kept landing on, 90 minutes, was too short for an accident and too long for a coincidence. She'd spent her whole career learning the difference between those two things. She found Farkas outside the third-floor nurse's station at 12:47 p.m. "There's a pharmacy tech named Oren Geddes," Ivy said without preamble. "He's accessed this floor 4 times since 6 a.m., once at shift start, normal. The other 3 aren't." Farkas looked at her without speaking. Medication rounds on a post-surgical floor happen on a schedule. The gaps he's hitting 7:40, 10:15, 12:30, none of them are standard medication windows for a recovery patient. They're gap windows, the times between nursing documentation cycles when there's the least movement in the hallway. She paused. "I noticed because my father used to talk about gap windows in K9 patrol routes. It's the same logic. You move during the spaces." Farkas said carefully, "How long have you been tracking this?" "Since 9 a.m. A pause. "Stay here." Geddes was not a pharmacy technician. His credentials were legitimate. The system accepted his badge on every swipe. But his hire date was 14 months ago, which was 3 months after Barnett had begun an investigation that Farkas could not share the details of, except that it existed and that someone had spent considerable time and money trying to interrupt it. What Farkas told Ivy directly. Geddes had been photographing the floor layout, the nursing documentation schedule, the camera positions in the recovery wing. Nothing about Barnett's chart, everything about access. "He wasn't scoping the patient," Ivy said. "He was scoping the building." "Yes, because someone else is coming." Farkas's expression didn't change in any specific way, but she set her pen down. "We believe Barnett's location was communicated to at least 2 parties. The party that organized the original shooting and a secondary contact who's been positioned in this area for 4 days. Geddes was reconnaissance. What comes next is not." Ivy looked at the table. She thought about the gap windows, about the way a Belgian Malinois moved when it had identified a threat, the specific redistribution of weight, the spine-going level, the quality of readiness that was different from aggression in ways most people didn't know how to read. "You need to move him," she said. "Moving him creates a documentation trail. His current room is logged under a cover designation. If we change it, if you don't change it and someone comes through that door with a floor plan Geddes photographed this morning, you have a post-surgical patient with no mobility, 1 service dog, and a locked door that opens from the outside." She looked at Farkas. "My father used to say the worst position in the field isn't exposed. It's cornered, at least exposed, you can move." Farkas was quiet for a moment. "I'll need clinical justification for the transfer," she said. "He's running a low-grade fever. I can document the reasoning for a room change. His temperature this morning was 99.4. Post-surgical fever monitoring is standard. It's not a lie. Moving a post-surgical gunshot patient 14 hours out from repair was not a neutral event. It was 4 people, careful management of the IV line positions, a conversation with the covering physician that I kept deliberately technical, an echo, who moved with the transfer as if he'd done this before, repositioning without being told, settling at the foot of the new bed before the wheels had even stopped. They put Barnett in a room on the 2nd floor's west wing under Ivy's nursing assignment. The floor nurse, a steady woman named Nola, who had absorbed the FBI's presence on her floor with impressive composure, managed the paperwork without asking questions Ivy didn't have answers for. Barnett was awake during the transfer. He watched everything with the dark, evaluating calm of someone who had spent years assessing situations from disadvantaged positions. When they settled him into the new room, his eyes found Ivy. "The dog trusts you," he said. His voice was rough from the intubation. "The bracelet," she said. He looked at her wrist. Something moved across his face, recognition and something quieter underneath it. Fort Selby. "My father." He didn't ask more than that. She didn't offer more. "Who transferred me?" he said. "My call," Farkas agreed. He absorbed that. "Geddes in custody as of 40 minutes ago. She checked the IV line, adjusted the drip rate. Someone photographed your original floor's layout. The room change buys you time." "How much?" She looked at him. "Depends on who's coming and how much they already knew." He held her eyes for a moment. Then he looked at Echo, who had settled at the foot of the bed with his head on his paws, still watching the door. He does that when he knows something's wrong, Barnett said. He's been doing it since the trauma bay. Yeah, a pause, carefully controlled against the pain. He's usually right. At 4:17 p.m., Farkas came in with her jaw set at a specific angle that Ivy had learned in the past 14 hours meant new information of the uncomfortable variety. "Jed is his phone," she said. "We pulled the communications. The secondary contact received Barnett's original room number at 6:58 this morning, 12 minutes after the recovery suite assignment was logged." She paused. The only external system that received that log update was a federal secure notification routed through our field office. The room was quiet. "Someone in your office," Barnett said. "We're running the access log now." "How many people received the notification?" 6. Ivy watched Barnett's face. Not what was on it, what was underneath it. The specific controlled stillness of someone running through a list in their head, putting names against the number 6, arriving at conclusions they didn't want to arrive at. "Spear," he said. Farkas said nothing. "I've worked with Spear for 3 years, Barnett said. Not an argument, a statement of something that had just changed shape." "I know." Farkas's voice was flat and not unkind. "We're confirming." Ivy finished with the monitor leads and stepped back. She thought about Geddes, about the gap windows, about all the careful scaffolding someone had built over months to make this moment possible. And she thought about Spear at the consultation room table, not looking at her when she answered questions, only looking up when she stopped talking. She had filed that as a personality trait. It was something else. "The secondary contact," she said. "Is he positioned or mobile?" "Positioned, surveilling the hospital exterior." "From where?" "We're trying to." The parking structure on Aldine. Ivy hadn't moved. "There's a gray sedan on the 3rd level that's been there since this morning. I noticed it from the 3rd floor break room window at 11 a.m. I didn't have a reason to log it then." Farkas looked at her for a long moment. "Show me." The gray sedan was gone by the time Farkas's team reached the structure, but the space it had occupied was still warm on infrared, and the team positioned at the service entrance reported movement in the loading corridor at 5:04 p.m., a single figure in green administrative scrubs, moving against the wall rather than down the center. Not the way someone moved when they were lost. The way someone moved when they were navigating by a floor plan. Ivy was already in the 2nd floor corridor when the stairwell door opened. Farkas had told her to stay in Barnett's room. She had stayed for approximately 4 minutes, until she'd done the arithmetic on the service entrance, the 2nd floor access, and the green scrubs that matched vendor and facilities staff on this level. The arithmetic had produced an answer that meant she couldn't stay. The man coming out of the stairwell was heavy-set, early 50s, moving with the particular invisible confidence of someone who had done this kind of thing before. He hadn't seen her yet. She was at the alcove corner, partially behind the supply cart she'd been pretending to inventory. She watched him check the room number on the 1st door, move to the 2nd. He was 3 doors from Barnett's room. Echo came through the door gap before she'd made a decision. The dog appeared in the corridor without a sound, positioned himself between Ivy and the man in scrubs, and stood. Not growling, not lunging, just stood there in the way a 90-pound animal stood when it had made a determination and was waiting for the situation to catch up to it. The man stopped. His eyes moved from the dog to Ivy. Something in his expression degraded, the performance of belonging, peeling back. "Can I help you find something?" Her voice was steady, professional, the voice she used when managing a waiting room full of people who had been there too long. "This is a restricted recovery wing. Visiting hours start at 8. He said nothing, looked at Echo again. The stairwell door at the far end of the corridor opened. Farkas came through first, 2 agents behind her in tactical gear that hadn't been visible anywhere in the building until this moment, which meant she had called them in before she'd left for the parking structure and hadn't mentioned it, and that was, Ivy decided, the correct call. "Federal agents," Farkas's voice carried clearly, "hands where I can see them." The man, Beau Crandall, as the next hour, would establish a private contractor whose history went back further than his clean-enough federal record had suggested, put his hands up slowly, running the same calculation Ivy had watched Gedges run. What did resistance cost against what it gained? Echo held his position until Farkas had Crandall against the wall. Then he sat. Spear was arrested at the field office at 5:47 p.m., 11 minutes after Crandall's arrest at the hospital. The timing was Farkas's doing, coordinated specifically so neither man could warn the other. Spear was feeding location data, Farkas said, in the consultation room for the third time. The box of tissues had been moved to the corner. The chairs were arranged differently. We don't have the full picture yet, but the contact goes back at least 8 months. He was not the architect of this. He was a node. Scared and compromised and making decisions he thought were limited in scope. She paused. They're never limited in scope. Did Barnett know? Ivy asked. He had a suspicion. He filed a report 14 months ago flagging an anomaly in the notification chain. He was told it was a system error. Ivy said nothing. He kept records, Farkas said, physical records, a notebook, in Echo's collar lining. Farkas looked at her. He told me this afternoon, Ivy said. He said if anything happened to him, the records were in Echo's gear, left seam. She paused. I told him that was either the smartest or the most irresponsible choice I'd ever heard, depending on the outcome. The corner of Farkas's mouth moved, almost. We retrieved it an hour ago. The documentation is comprehensive, enough to close the question of what Spear was doing and for how long. She set her hands flat on the table. Barnett was right about the anomaly. He was told he was wrong. He spent 14 months building the case to prove he wasn't. Ivy thought about that, the specific discipline of working alongside a situation you knew was wrong and couldn't yet prove, carrying the knowledge without letting it surface before it was ready to matter. Her father had done a version of that once. Flagged a training protocol at Fort Selby he believed was producing dangerous behavioral responses in dogs that should have been washed from the program, reported it, been told he was overcalibrating, kept detailed notes for 2 years until a handler was injured, and the notes became the only contemporaneous record of what had been reported and when. He'd never talked about it as courage, he'd talked about it as patience. She understood the distinction better now. She went in to see Barnett after. He was sitting up in the bed, which was more than he should have been doing, and Echo had relocated from the foot of the bed to the chair beside it, which was apparently what the chair was for now. Sit back, she said, looking at the incline angle. He sat back 2 inches. It was a negotiation, and she accepted it. 3 years, he said, after she'd finished with the IV line. Spear and I worked the same floor for 3 years. She sat in the other chair and didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say. She'd watched her father learn, after the Fort Selby report, that the colleague who'd helped bury it had been protecting his own approval ratings. The damage from that had been slow working and quiet in a way that 30 years of physical fieldwork hadn't been. The notebook, she said finally. 14 months. You kept it on Echo. He looked at the dog. He's the one thing in the equation I was certain about. She thought about the logic of that. When you didn't know who to trust, you trusted the thing with the clearest set of loyalties. Echo had been trained to protect Theo Barnett. There was no ambiguity in it, no competing interests, no hidden communications. Your father, Barnett said, he was at Selby for 22 years. Yes. What happened to him? Heart attack. 3 months after he retired, she looked at the bracelet. He was going to start teaching the handler certification program. He never got to. Barnett was quiet for a moment. He taught you anyway. By proximity, she looked at Echo, who had raised his head and was watching her with the amber patience of an animal that understood more than it was given credit for. I wasn't a handler. I was just around. I watched what he did. I watched how the dogs responded to him. A pause. You learn a lot about how to read a room by watching a trained animal read a room. The monitor beeped softly. His heart rate had come down another 4 points. Get some rest, she said. You have another 14 hours of antibiotics, and your body is going to start demanding what it's owed whether you agree to it or not. He looked at her for a moment with the evaluating calm she'd learned was just how his face worked. You've been on shift since 3 a.m. I'm aware. That's 17 hours. I've done longer. She stood, adjusted the kinked IV line near the port. Sleep. Echo made a small sound. The adjustment of a large animal settling into a new position, the specific quality of presence offered when it had decided the situation was, for now, resolved. She looked at him. He looked back. She had spent her whole childhood watching her father's dogs make that assessment. The moment a trained animal decided that the space it was in was handled. Not safe, never fully safe. Handled. She understood, standing in that hospital room at the end of a very long Tuesday, that was exactly what the past 17 hours had been. The federal commendation arrived 6 weeks later in a standard envelope, delivered to the hospital's administrative office, and forwarded to her through the charge nurse coordinator. No external markings. Nothing that identified the sender before she opened it. A single page. Her name, the date, a formal summary of her contribution to an ongoing federal investigation. The language was precise and deliberately dry, the way official documents were when the people writing them understood that the weight was in the fact of the document, not in the phrasing. She read it once in the break room, folded it, put it in her locker. She was 2 hours into her next shift when Nola found her at the station and said, with the specific neutrality of someone who didn't know how to categorize what she was reporting, "There's a man in the main lobby, says he's not a patient, says you'll know him." She did. Barnett was standing near the window, not sitting. He'd put on weight since the surgery, the healthy kind. Color back, posture easier, moving well with only the slight right-side compensation that would probably even out over the next few weeks. Beside him, Echo sat with his tactical vest and orange service patch and his amber eyes tracking the lobby with the same systematic patience he brought to every room. She crossed the lobby. He turned when she was halfway across. "You look better," she said. "You look tired," he said. "I'm always tired." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small paper bag from a coffee shop. "I didn't know what you took in your coffee. I asked the front desk nurse." She looked at the bag, looked at him. "You drove 40 minutes to bring me a sandwich." "And coffee," she said, "oat milk." He paused. "I don't understand that, but I ordered it." She took the bag. Echo leaned against her left leg. Not dramatically, just the quiet animal decision to put his weight against something he had determined was solid. She felt it through her scrubs and did not step away. "The investigation," she said. Moving, Crandall gave up enough to open 2 new threads. "It's going to be another year before it's fully closed." A pause. "But Spear is in custody. The notebook documentation held. The case is real." She nodded. She thought about what it meant to build something carefully enough over 14 months that it held when it finally mattered. To carry the weight of knowing something was wrong, without reporting too early and losing the ground you'd built. Her father had called it patience with a purpose. He'd said it like it was different from waiting. Like the distinction mattered. She thought he'd been right. "The program I applied to," she said, "Federal Protective Medicine Liaison, Civilian-Military Medical Handoff Protocols." "I know." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "Farkas may have mentioned it. I may have written a letter." She looked at him for a moment. Then at Echo, who had lifted his head and was watching her with the expression she had come to understand as his version of straightforward regard. No agenda, no performance, just the clear-eyed assessment of an animal that had already decided what it thought and saw no reason to obscure it. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know." He met her eyes. "I wanted there to be a record of what you did, of why it matters. Not just for your sake, though I hope it helps. Because the next time someone comes through those doors at 3 in the morning and the situation needs someone who knows how to read a room, I want the system to know that person exists." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about every time she'd read a room correctly and had the reading absorbed into the general noise. Credit dissolved into the team outcome. The specific pattern recognition she'd spent years developing treated as instinct rather than skill, because instinct was easier to file away and forget. She thought about what it felt like to have that named. Not celebrated, not dramatized. Just clearly and precisely named by someone with the authority to make the naming mean something. She hadn't done any of it for the record. But she was glad the record existed. "Thank you," she said. "No," he said. "Thank you." Echo straightened, stepped back to Barnett's side, and sat. His job, whatever he had decided it was apparently complete. Barnett reached down and touched the dog's head once, brief, the way you acknowledged a colleague who had done exactly what was needed, and then looked at her. "Same shift tomorrow?" he asked. 7 a.m. "Then eat that now." He nodded at the bag. "While you still have time." She opened the bag. The coffee was still warm. She stood in the lobby of Kellerton Regional at the end of a long shift, eating a sandwich she actually tasted this time, and thought about her father, who had spent 22 years teaching dogs to trust the right people, and who had, without knowing it, taught his daughter the same thing. The doors behind her opened again. Another gurney. The night restarting the way nights at a trauma hospital always restarted, without pause, without ceremony, because the work was never finished, only continued, one shift at a time, by the people who knew how to stay in the room. She crumpled the empty bag, dropped it in the bin by the door, and went back to work.